Oh, what joy to recall those days. Back in 1969, 1970, when Jill Conway and I were thinking about starting a women's history course. The period was one of ferment, and the campus more generally, and in Canada more generally, with a lot of concern about the new feminist movement. But we were particularly concerned, to begin with, with women's place in the university. The situation on campus was generating questions about daycare for women students who had children, and the relationship of women to the university governance. A lot of new ideas were developing. Jill and I were colleagues, two women in a very large male history department. She had tenure. I was working toward that status. I had come from another department, but we had long conversations together about our work. There were no courses in women's history when we started. Jill herself was giving courses on American colonial history and other topics. And I was talking about the Reformation and social change and economic organization. So even we were not doing anything on this topic. I think that the ferment gave us additional impetus to start a course. I think that was part of the picture.
The film that you are about to see attempts to capture the spirit of the modern university. The university portrayed is the University of Toronto. My name is Claude Bissell, and I am the president. In Canadian terms, it is an old university. It is also a university that has felt the responsibility for all of the major areas of study, and has tried, successfully I think, to distribute its support so that no important area of knowledge is overlooked.
I tended to always have men at the foreground of my work. Always men were my actors. And here I was meeting Jill, talking away, and she is showing me how women, in the American case, could be not only extremely interesting for a study of social and cultural history, but could also have a story that could be foregrounded in the historical narrative, that could help you tell by themselves how American political life changed. Where again, to go back to my case, I was bringing women in sort of on the side when I talked about artisan movements or when I talked about religious change in a French 16th century city. But until then, I hadn't seen how the question of women and their status could carry an historical narrative. That's what I learned from Jill. And it was with that insight that that shared insight, we began to think about a course.
That's amazing. I was really interested to see just how that course at that time not only was a measure of her research interests, but also how it captured something about the political moment in Toronto and on campus. My name is Shauna Sweeney. I am an assistant professor of women and gender studies and history at the University of Toronto, and my research is on Jamaican market women in the 18th and 19th centuries and their lives during slavery and the period of freedom. Of course, I was kind of awestruck and a little nervous to speak with Professor Davis, but I was also really excited because I'd read so much of her work and I just wanted to know more about how she created this course, how she decided to mount the first women's history course at U of T. that to me was really amazing, how she was able to unearth these layers of political meaning to mounting the course in 71. There was so much going on around the campus co-op daycare, organizing for childcare on campus, that it was open to the community, which is, I think, more or less a rarity now on campus, unfortunately. So there was so much more beyond just the course content itself. There was a broader or deeper political meaning to it that was really interesting and important.
There were many struggles that we had for the women's status on campus. One that I had been concerned about going back to the 1960s, 1965, when I had first come here, was the lack of provision for women with children, or men with children for that matter, on campus. I met a number of women working for their MA or PhD on campus who had children, and together we decided to do a study. We did a questionnaire, because that was make an impact on people with our evidence and our statistics. So we did a questionnaire about their experience. We found quite a number of women who, in this category, we specifically wanted them to be in an advanced program, and drew up a description, and we made a number of recommendations, including for daycare and longer hours at the library, so that people who were who needed to work in the evening because they couldn't get babysitters or other. We had a whole bunch of recommendations. I remember taking it to the dean, office of one of the deans, and having him be quite inattentive to it. Never heard back. None of these changes were made, but it was important, and I think this is always central for women when they go to any setting. It was important that we had created a group. We had some solidarity, that we knew each other. We also had men who supported us. And I think that made a difference in our consciousness and our action in our own departments, both as graduate students. There were a few of us who were young faculty members. I really think that was very, very important. Maybe our study helped stir up the ferment that later led to the famous, I think of it as famous, was for a time on campus, movement for daycare. There had been an empty house not far from campus, which had been taken over by a group of young women, and was being used for a provisional daycare, since the university had nothing. Well, the university sent in the police to close that down, and in response to that, the students who were deeply concerned about the situation decided to have a sit-in in the Senate building. And I went to visit them and see what their demands were, and tried indeed to communicate to the university at a huge meeting that we had, to Bissell, what the students demanded. And it seemed to me, and another young woman faculty member supported this, seemed to me that they were perfectly legitimate demands. And indeed, Bissell, who referred to me as not Dr. Davis or Professor Davis, but Mrs. Davis, did agree to put up $2,000 to start a daycare, and the students left. So, we won that one. We won it. So just as with our women's history course, we got away with it.
Right.
I think what eventually became her book, Women on the Margins, in 1995, she was already kind of drawing on research from that work and sharing it with her students. And it was really interesting for me to hear that, because it made me want to dig into my own archive that I'm working with for my current manuscript and share it with students too, because I think it's such a great way to share primary sources that aren't the kind of standard primary sources we might share.
I always, in my own work, and Jill too, have wanted to put together general trends and the structure of a situation, the mechanism of change, together with good stories and individual people. That's been my trademark. Have always, because I think it shows what the experience of history is like. We wanted them to read the autobiographies, if we could find them, books by women. And if possible, not just women of very elevated status. That being a social historian, I wanted to, if possible, get books by middle-class women, and if even possible, getting sources by women from the working people. And we found an autobiography by a 17th century Jewish merchant woman named Glickel Hammel from Germany. This meant we could bring a Jewish woman into a course which would have Christians, of course, and we could bring in, because she talked a lot about her commerce, but we could show her at work. So this was the kind of text that could show a range of women's activity, as well as men, because she talks about her husband, she talks about her sons, she talks about her relationship to men. And again, it shows the kind of widening that this course allowed us to do.
Yeah, it sounds so novel, and the students must have been so excited. What was the response, especially for students that hadn't, even if they weren't at U of T? I understand that maybe the course was open to auditors, to community members. What was the response to reading some of these things for the first time? What do you remember the energy like?
Well, I think they were surprised. They hadn't, I mean, to begin with, since I hadn't worked on this until to the late 1960s, 1970s, I was surprised. I didn't know that there would be a text like Glickel Hammel's autobiography, and I found many other texts. I think that they were surprised. I think they were deeply interested, and I think it generated in their lives, I think, new ways of not only looking at history, but the ways of looking at the social relations in which they were involved. I would like to, if I may, brag about another innovation that we put into the course that may have been quite important for some of our students. We had a section on sexuality. That was very early along. We opened with medical theories, in both courses, in her course and in her course in American, we did this. We opened with medical theories about what people believed counted for gender at that time. And then we began to look at family structure, again, a new topic for much of history at the time. But we added something that was really pioneering. We added a section on sexuality. And we looked looked at the texts that talked about whether women had orgasms, and we looked at what sources we had about the quality of sexual experience in heterosexual marriage. But we decided, and Jill was very willing to go along with this, that we would have a whole section on same-sex love. Especially women, we had a little bit on added on the men, because we always tried to do gender as well as, we tried to do men as well as women. And we found, again, a wonderful source, the ladies of Llangollen, who were 18th century English women. They were aristocrats. Can't have everything. I would have liked to have had working people too. But for that period, they were very interesting women. And they were well known, and they carried it off. Partly because they were aristocrats and they had a great estate, and they could. We also tried to look a little bit. It was very difficult at the time. There was very, very little source material literature. Again, I would like to evoke that period for you, why it was so innovative. In some places, say in France, which was my field, where I was part of the first collective volume that was issued in France on the history of women. I was the editor of one of the editors of the early modern section. For bringing in, at that date, we're a little bit forward in time already now, after the 70s, on into the 80s, to bring in same-sex love into a collection on the history of women in France was thought of as so radical that they wouldn't have that chapter. They would not have the chapter. Wow. I felt very badly about that. How can we talk about sexuality? They felt it was just too dangerous. Well, so I just want to mention that to say that we didn't think it was dangerous at all. We thought it was absolutely essential to teaching the course, and I think that meant something. Remember, we're in we're early 1971, 70. I think that meant something to our students in the class. I know it did because I talked quite a lot about that with both male and female students when I was at Berkeley. that they were glad that that was simply made part of the story.
In preparing for the interview with Professor Davis, I went through her work again, and what was really fascinating and really heartening for me to encounter was how invested in archives she was. I mean, of course, she's a historian, but I think so many of the questions that currently puzzle people working on Black Atlantic history or histories of slavery about how to kind of access these stories of people who didn't leave written records themselves, who were otherwise only remarked upon through violence. I think that there are some real lessons there in terms of how she was reading these early modern sources. And of course we know that, but it was really nice to return to her writing and see how she used these kind of documents that weren't traditional sources for historians to really uncover what everyday people experienced, whether it was violence or how they thought of themselves in relation to the king. These are really kind of fascinating things that she was able to pull out. So I loved Professor Davis's excitement about the syllabus for her course, and it really resonated with me because I too get excited creating the syllabi for my courses. And I guess I like to think of it as kind of an intellectual dream dinner party. Like, who do you want to be in conversation with? And what kinds of conversations can those texts together, what kinds of new questions can they generate? So think about who you want around the table, so to speak, and what each person, what each thinker brings to that table. Something that I've learned from Professor Davis and other historians has been the value of interdisciplinarity, especially in women and gender studies. That's kind of a given, drawing on fields like anthropology, sociology, literary theory, and criticism is really essential in some cases to illuminating the importance of history, I think, in my history courses, drawing on those other fields. So being excited and thinking about the syllabus as an intellectual experiment or dinner party, I think can be really useful.
It was quite a challenge to assemble a syllabus for that course. There were no textbooks.
Right.
And I'm not sure that we would have even wanted to use a textbook. We sort of were going to tell the overall stories ourselves. At least at that stage, we didn't feel we needed a textbook. But we needed the students to be able to read something. So we had the excitement and challenge of running around and finding sources that we could use for our students. Jill, working in the 18th and 19th century, had many more printed sources, and she had newspapers that she could find with women's voices in them and religious texts that she could use. I had more of a challenge for the early modern period, and I remember one of the persons who said, "You'll never be able to teach a course of this kind. You won't be able to find any sources." Well, in fact, there were. We not only had major figures like writers like Christine de Pizan, who talked about the city of ladies and defended women's reputation, but we also, I skirted around and found texts like Barry Wollstonecraft's, and that was a well-known vindication of the rights of women in the late 18th century, at the time of the French Revolution, or for that period, Olympe de Gouges. Now there was an example, a figure that was not particularly known. It was hardly even a woman who defended the right of women to have rights along with men at the time of the French Revolution. At the time that I found out about her, she was just being discovered by some women historians in France. At that time, Olympe de Gouges was not even integrated into French histories of the Revolution. They weren't doing anything. Or if they were, it was women who were doing it on the side. They weren't doing it. So Olympe de Gouges wrote a wonderful text at the same time as Mary Wollstonecraft about women's rights. So I translated it into French, actually from the French. I translated it into English, and we typed it up for a mimeograph, and we mimeographed it and handed it out to the students. Or for working on women's work, I found, that was a wonderful text. I found a book, the first book ever written by a midwife. I couldn't find any peasant women who had written about themselves. For that, I had to find descriptions of them in books at the time. But I found Louise Bourgeois was the name of this woman. She was French, And she proudly said, "I am the first woman of my craft to write a book about it." And it didn't merely include all kinds of advice about what to do during a difficult childbirth or even pregnancy. It was a medical text, but she had her autobiography. And she talked about how she had begun as a craftswoman herself. She had married a man who was a surgeon, and how she gradually began to deliver babies and then became an important midwife. This was late 16th, early 17th century. What a treat to have a text like that.
Yeah.
So I translated parts of that. That was too long. I translated a lot of the autobiography for the students.
Yeah.
And we mimeographed that.
Oh, wow.
Handed that out. So that was how I did it. And then Libby Cohen, who was our teacher, helped find sources. She checked into the library and found more autobiographies. Mm-hmm. We were using Glickel, the Jewish woman's, which existed in English, and it was published. What a miracle! We could even get it for the students. But she found some others that we could put on reserve or recommend. I did some translation for the French. At that time, we couldn't count on the students being able to read the French. Right. So that was how we did it. We tried to get it for the whole range of religious life. Was not so much of a problem because we had religious women who often write about their mystical experiences or other experiences. Mm-hmm. So we usually could find. I don't know whether we used Saint Teresa of Avila, her great autobiography for Catholic life, or not. But we had that, and much of this generated later projects. Yeah. These syllabi were circulated all across North America. Ours was one of the first, and we could see echoes of ours and others, and we learned from other people's. They were circulated all around, and many of these generated projects. I mean, people who went on and wrote books about these people or edited these books that we had been mimeographing up. So there was, there was a whole generations of books and papers that grew out of our first struggles.
Yeah, and given that there's so many new things on the syllabus and the course itself was new, is there anything you felt as though, looking back, there was a limitation or limitations to the course that you wish you could have changed, or is there a way that the course had you thinking about how to expand your thinking on women's history? Thinking
back on the limitations in our course, pioneering though it was, I would say there were some. And the most important was that we did not do enough with the issue of race, of color, or colonialism. Granted, I mean, I just want to stress that we were doing a lot of things that were new, but still, it should have been a regular theme. And I might well have brought in some colonialism. I didn't know how to do it. I myself was a European historian, and at that point, again, go back to the 50s and 60s, there was a huge division in history departments and in courses and in scholarly work between those who were doing European social history and those who were doing colonial history. Indeed, at that period, really back in the 50s, 60s, colonial history was often dominated by those who were doing diplomacy, who were looking at the colonies from the point of view of authorities, maybe of settlers, but even colonial history was not the history of the people being oppressed, the colonial populations. Right. So it was the whole scene.
I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit more about the impact of the class that first year.
That first year had 200 people, students auditing and students signed up for the class, as well as listeners. My husband, who was a faculty member, sat in the back together with other men and women who wanted to sit there. It was held in New College. We had really a very large group. They were mostly women. We had some male students. That has been in my experience in all my years teaching, both here at Toronto and then later on when I was at Berkeley and Princeton. We always had a majority of women students, a small number of very interesting male students who wanted to take the course either because they were themselves interested in gender, or because they saw it as a new kind of social and cultural economic history. They were interested in the methodology as well. Not that the women weren't. It wasn't, and we didn't see this just as I repeat again, just as a kind of consciousness raising thing. If it was that, that's fine. But I repeat again that we saw this as a very exciting history course with methodological implications, and I think our students, women and men, shared that excitement. The history department pretty much let us go with this course. They did not impede us. I never felt that the University of Toronto history department was going to put barriers in our way to doing this course. By the time we gave it, and maybe I should come back to this, our work was being recognized. By the time we were doing this, I had won prizes for some of my essays. Jill's thesis was very seriously appreciated, was taken very seriously and much approved. So I think that the fact that our status was being appreciated, being approved by others in the field was a big help. That in 1971, the same year that we started the course, I gave my first big paper up at the American Historical Association, and it was on religion. It was on religion, and it was very, very much appreciated. I got a big response, and it was published and so on. And past and present asked for it, and I published it elsewhere. But they knew that I was being approved by colleagues in the field. And by the time we gave it, I'd also had spent a half a year actually it was, teaching at the University of California at Berkeley. And I think they thought, well, if Berkeley can accept Natalie, and if Jill is getting her PhD from Harvard, maybe these women are acceptable to the university.
It was a little bit, I don't know, I want to say serendipitous to find out that the course that Professor Davis offered was actually offered or taught in the classroom where I teach Women and Gender Studies 360 methods, a feminist methods undergraduate class. It felt really cool that we're teaching in the same classroom, but also the space itself, it made me think about incorporating community a bit more, because she was inviting community members into her class in '71. There's no reason that we can't do that now. And so it's really special that this space on campus kind of retains that legacy, because all these years later, we're still teaching in that classroom.
The course itself continued. I left, as I say, but Jill continued the American side as long as she was here several more years, so she left to become president of Smith College. And others picked it up finally and continued it for a time. So it had an intellectual future, and I'm sure generated young people for graduate programs. I'm sure that happened. I mean, ultimately there was a graduate program in women's studies and women's history developed at the University of Toronto. In terms of my own relationship, my own future, not only did I continue the course at Berkeley and Princeton with great delight, but around Toronto, now that I'm back here, I sometimes see people who are in the course, or over the years people have written me or emailed me. They say, I was in your course, and it made a difference to me. Either it made a difference in a scholarly way, or sometimes it just made a difference in terms of their thinking about their own position. Most of these were women, not only women, but mostly women that I heard from. Their own position as women, and thinking about their future life. Either the way they would combine family with scholarship, or what they decided to do, or what it meant to them to be women. So that has been a very great treat. I can't always remember. It was a big class. I can't always remember the people, but the face might be familiar still after all these years.
And was it open to members of the public as well?
Yes, yes. Anybody. I don't know how many off-campus people we had, but anybody who wanted to come in, and I think that was important. And we did not dilute the academic quality of the course. We kept it as it was.
What are some of your thoughts as a pioneering women and gender historian on the direction that the field has taken recently?
Here was what would be my hopes or my recommendations for the next generation. One, and here I'm especially thinking of the dialogue and debate going on in the West right now, but I think it's a creative one, is that the whole issue of what gender is, what we called sexes back in 1969-70, the way we began our course with the definitions of Christine de Bizan and so on, and the look at the early biology, that whole topic, which I thought we had sort of resolved, is completely exploded today. That is, with all the interest and debate about trans and issues around that, the question of what the sexes are, of what gender is, all the new work in biology, especially the development of fetus and the early birth experiences, all of that has created a very exciting set of questions and debates. So it seems to me that has to be, at least for the immediate future, a very important task to be taken by women's and gender history courses, and to done with good spirit and with imaginative research for sources and very interdisciplinary. It has to be looked at from a whole range. So that would be one thing, at least for the immediate future. A second hope would be the continuing expansion of the field beyond the West. I mean, it's still much of the publication. It's much improved, but still a lot of it is Western oriented, and it's certainly a great amount of work has been done on Black women's history and gender history. But I think a continuing expansion of the field to look at colonial histories, to look indeed at prehistory as well. That's a whole other big topic, and collaborative work with people from India, from China, from the African lands. It seems the African gender history just seems to be a wonderful field of possibility. So I think that's a second new development that we can hope for. And a third is continuing, and I think this is very important, a continuing strengthening of interdisciplinary work. Indeed, women's, it's got to be done thinking of serious research in a way that doesn't jeopardize the training that we all need in our special fields to do research. I'm thinking, let's think of the graduate level, that a historian has to know how to use archives and to read difficult handwriting and what kind of myriad sources to use, and if he or she is doing oral history, knows how to do that. So we have a lot of very specific techniques, bibliographical techniques, research techniques. We cannot ignore those. So when I say interdisciplinary, I don't mean ignoring the crafts of our trade. The same is true of people in literature. They have their specific work on texts and sort of literary traditions that we have to continue to do that. We should share those techniques, but we have to know them. But the field, if it's not going to get rigidified, has got to have that continuing interdisciplinary collaboration. Maybe a final thought is the importance, and maybe this is happening, of gender studies having an impact on other disciplines. I mean, I don't just mean interdisciplinary collaboration, I mean outward. Having an impact beyond the women's studies program or beyond the women's studies courses in a department, that colleagues know what we're doing and that they continually integrated into their work. Maybe that's happening, but I do think that that's another priority. The field has so much to give, it has so many treasures to offer. I want them to be received and used.
Thank you so much, Natalie. It's been an honor to speak with you and to hear all of your experiences. It's so useful.
This is such a pleasure, especially thinking about the way you young folk are carrying on our tradition and expanding it way beyond anything we dreamed of.
Thank you so much.
Fight for a world of equality, infused with mutual respect and generosity. That's perfect.